It started quietly, almost too quietly for something that would shake North America's trade balance. When Mark Carney walked up to the podium this week and responded to fresh pressure from Washington, many expected anger or at least visible strain. Instead, what people saw was calm, measured, controlled. And that calm is exactly why this moment matters more than it seems, because countries under real pressure usually do not sound like this. Leaders backed into a corner do not speak with patience. But Carney did, and that raised a much bigger question. What does he know that Washington may have overlooked? For nearly a year, Canada has been living under the shadow of the most aggressive trade confrontation in decades. Tariffs, threats, public warnings, and behind closed doors, pressure. Yet here was the Prime Minister of a country deeply tied to the US economy, speaking without urgency, without fear, almost as if this was not the emergency everyone assumed it to be. That tone alone should make you pause, because behind it sits a strategy that did not begin this week or even last month. It began much earlier, and it has been quietly reshaping Canada's position while most eyes were fixed elsewhere. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to February 2025. That was the moment everything changed. President Trump announced sweeping tariffs of 25% on a wide range of Canadian goods: lumber, steel, dairy, core industries that support entire regions. This was not framed as a temporary move or a bargaining chip. It was direct, punishing. The message was blunt: comply or absorb the damage. For Canada, the threat was existential. Roughly 3/4 of its exports move south into the United States. No other trading relationship comes close. When your largest customer suddenly turns into your primary source of economic risk, conventional wisdom says you concede early, you negotiate fast, you limit losses. Many analysts believed that was exactly what would happen. Canada, they argued, had no room to resist. Then politics shifted in Ottawa. In March 2025, Mark Carney won the Liberal Party leadership and became Prime Minister. He stepped into office already under fire. There was no honeymoon period, no grace window. Within weeks, pressure intensified. By April, the US expanded tariffs to include automobiles, adding another 25%. Aluminum and steel soon followed. Each announcement landed like a hammer blow. Tens of thousands of jobs were suddenly at risk. Entire supply chains began to crack. Every week brought new headlines predicting recession, layoffs, and long-term damage. At that stage, many were watching not just Canada, but Carney himself. Former central banker, technocrat, known for caution, known for careful words. The assumption was simple: under sustained pressure, he would blink. He would compromise early to stabilize the situation. That is not what happened. Instead, Canada responded in a way few expected. Carney approved $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs, but these were not broad, unfocused measures. They were precise, targeted, American goods chosen not by accident, but by political geography. Orange juice from Florida, appliances tied to swing states, alcohol sourced from districts with influential lawmakers. The goal was not economic symmetry, it was political impact. Then came the statement that truly shifted the tone. Speaking publicly, Carney said that nothing was off the table when it came to defending Canadian interests. On its own, that phrase might sound ordinary. Politicians say things like that all the time. But coming from someone whose reputation was built on restraint, it landed differently. In Washington, it was taken as a signal. Canada was prepared to escalate. This was no longer a one-sided pressure campaign. For the first time since the trade conflict began, US officials had to consider an uncomfortable possibility: that Canada might not fold quickly, that prolonged pressure could produce resistance rather than submission. And once that realization set in, the dynamic changed. By midsummer 2025, the trade war had reached a critical point. Tariffs on non-USMCA covered imports climbed to 35%. Key Canadian industries were hurting. Layoffs increased. Business confidence dropped. On paper, Canada looked like it was losing badly. Then, almost without warning, Carney shifted course. Canada rolled back a large portion of its retaliatory tariffs. Not all of them, but enough to signal a change. In Washington, this was read as a breakthrough, proof that pressure was working. In Ottawa, critics accused Carney of retreat, but the surface-level reaction missed what was really happening. At the same time those tariffs were lifted, Canada made a series of calculated moves. The digital sales tax, a major point of tension with US tech firms, was suspended. Border security was tightened, directly addressing American concerns about illegal crossings and fentanyl trafficking. Defense spending was increased to meet NATO targets that Washington had long demanded. Taken together, these steps looked like concessions, but strategically, they did something far more important. They removed the justifications the US had been using to defend its trade actions. One by one, the talking points disappeared. Digital tax, addressed. Border security, addressed. Defense spending, addressed. The pressure narrative began to unravel. What Carney accomplished was subtle but powerful. He reframed the conflict. Canada was no longer the stubborn partner resisting change. It became the reasonable actor seeking solutions. Washington, by contrast, began to look inflexible, and in international trade disputes, perception matters almost as much as policy. If you are finding this analysis useful so far, this is a good moment to pause and subscribe to Dylan News. We break down stories like this beyond the headlines, so you understand not just what is happening, but why it matters. This shift in perception was not accidental. It was preparation, because the real fight was never about 2025. It was about what comes next, and that is where this story truly becomes interesting. To really understand why those moves mattered, you have to look ahead, not backward, because while most coverage stayed focused on daily tariff numbers and political soundbites, the real deadline was already set on the calendar, July 2026. That is when the United States, Canada, and Mexico are required to carry out a joint review of the USMCA trade agreement. This review is not symbolic. It decides the future of the entire framework. Either the agreement is confirmed and extended, or it enters renegotiation territory with the risk of collapse hanging over it. If even one country refuses to affirm the deal during that review, the countdown begins. Without a replacement, the agreement expires in 2036, and President Trump has made it clear he wants changes, major ones, stricter rules for the auto sector, tougher labor provisions, stronger limits on how Chinese companies use Canada and Mexico as indirect entry points into the US market. Seen through that lens, everything that happened in 2025 starts to look different. The tariffs, the retaliation, the sudden easing, none of it was random. This was positioning. Trump's strategy was straightforward. Apply enough economic pressure early, weaken Canada's leverage, and force concessions before the 2026 review even begins. By the time negotiators sit down, Ottawa would have no real options left. For much of 2025, that plan appeared to be working. Economic pain was real. Political pressure inside Canada was growing. Commentators openly questioned how long Carney could hold out. But what Washington underestimated was that Carney was not trying to win short-term victories. He was trying to survive, buy time, and quietly change the conditions of the negotiation that actually matters. While the spotlight stayed fixed on tariffs, Canada accelerated something else: trade diversification, faster than most expected, new agreements with European partners, expanded access to Asian markets, deeper integration with Pacific economies. These were not press releases for show. They created real alternatives, even if smaller than the US market. And in negotiation theory, alternatives are leverage, not because they fully replace your main partner, but because they give you the ability to say no. A country with no alternatives accepts bad terms to avoid collapse. A country with options, even limited ones, can resist pressure longer than expected. Carney spent much of 2025 building those options quietly, and at the same time, he managed the optics of the conflict. By removing tariffs and addressing US concerns, he shifted how the dispute looked from the outside. Canada appeared cooperative, rational. Washington appeared aggressive. That distinction is critical when negotiations involve more than two players. Mexico matters here. Its vote in the 2026 review carries weight. If Mexico views Canada as the stable, reasonable partner and the US as unpredictable, it changes the balance inside the room. Carney was not just negotiating with Washington, he was shaping how Canada would be perceived by everyone at the table. Fast forward to the end of 2025, and the situation looks very different from what many predicted earlier in the year. Canada is still under pressure. Some industries are still hurting, but the economy did not collapse. Roughly 85% of Canada-US trade continues tariff-free under USMCA exemptions. Supply chains adjusted, companies adapted. Growth slowed, but it held. That resilience matters because it means the strategy designed to create desperation did not fully succeed. And desperation was the core assumption behind the pressure campaign. Carney's latest statements reflect that reality. He says Canada is open to negotiations, but only without the constant threat of arbitrary tariffs. He offers a zero tariff proposal. Lift all duties, and Canada will do the same. Start fresh. No ultimatums, no panic. Just a clear option placed on the table. This is not the voice of a leader looking for an exit at any cost. It is the voice of someone who believes time is no longer working against him, someone who knows the real test is still ahead. And that brings us to the deeper question, one that goes beyond Canada and the United States. Does economic size still guarantee control in a world where even smaller economies can adapt faster than expected? Because if pressure only pushes partners to diversify and reduce dependence, then the old playbook starts to fail. What happens next will not be decided by headlines or speeches. It will be decided in the months leading up to that 2026 review. And by then, the balance of leverage may not look the way Washington originally planned. What makes this moment even more important is what it reveals about power itself. For decades, global trade operated on a simple assumption. Bigger economies dictate terms, smaller ones adjust. Pressure works because dependence leaves no room to resist. But the past year has exposed the cracks in that logic. When pressure is applied too aggressively, especially in unpredictable ways, it creates incentives to escape reliance altogether. That is exactly what Canada has been doing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Each new trade link, each alternative market reduces vulnerability just enough to matter. And here is the part many miss. Once those alternatives exist, they do not disappear when tensions ease, relationships form, supply chains adapt, habits change. Even if the US decides tomorrow to lift every tariff, Canada does not simply forget the lesson. The drive to diversify becomes permanent. This is why Carney's approach looks passive only on the surface. In reality, it has been about endurance, absorbing pain without panic, letting industries adjust instead of collapsing, allowing markets to reprice risk slowly rather than all at once. That kind of adaptation does not make headlines, but it reshapes leverage quietly. Inside Canada, this strategy was not universally popular. Job losses triggered anger, business leaders demanded faster relief. Political opponents accused the government of gambling with the economy, but Carney held the line. Because short-term relief achieved through bad long-term concessions would have locked Canada into weakness for decades. At the same time, Washington's strategy began to show diminishing returns. Tariffs that were meant to force rapid compliance instead produced delayed resistance. Political pressure spread back into the US itself as targeted Canadian retaliation hit specific regions. What was designed as external pressure started creating internal noise. That matters because trade wars are never just economic. They are political. Leaders respond not only to balance sheets, but to voters. And when pressure creates domestic discomfort without delivering clear wins, its effectiveness fades. By late 2025, the narrative had subtly shifted. Canada was no longer framed solely as the weaker partner under siege. It was increasingly seen as resilient, adaptive, willing to negotiate, but unwilling to be rushed into submission. That shift alone changed expectations for the 2026 talks. Carney's calm messaging played a key role here. No threats, no emotional appeals, just consistency, willingness to talk, willingness to compromise on secondary issues, absolute firmness on core sovereignty over trade decisions. That balance is difficult to maintain under pressure, but it builds credibility over time. Another factor strengthened Canada's hand: predictability. While Washington's approach fluctuated between escalation and outreach, Ottawa's position remained steady. That contrast was noticed internationally. Markets prefer stability, partners trust consistency. In multilateral settings, that trust becomes leverage. As the calendar moves closer to 2026, the stakes become clearer. This is not just about tariffs or market access. It is about whether economic coercion still works the way it once did, whether forcing pain guarantees control, or whether it simply accelerates fragmentation. Canada's experience suggests the latter. Pressure did not break alignment overnight, but it forced reconsideration, and reconsideration leads to diversification. Diversification leads to independence, not total independence, but enough to change the terms of engagement. The irony is hard to ignore. In trying to strengthen its position ahead of negotiations, Washington may have weakened the very leverage it relied on most, and Carney's role in that outcome was not dramatic. It was patient, strategic, almost understated, which brings us to the final stretch of this story, where everything converges, the negotiations ahead, the risks still on the table, and the question no one can yet answer: who will actually blink when the moment arrives? As the final months before the 2026 review approach, the picture becomes clearer, even if the outcome does not. Canada has not emerged unscathed. Entire sectors still carry scars from the past year. Workers felt the shock. Businesses were forced to rethink supply lines that once seemed permanent. But survival in this context was the objective. And by that measure, the strategy worked. What stands out now is how little urgency there is in Carney's messaging. He does not sound like a leader racing against the clock. He sounds like someone willing to wait. That alone alters the negotiating atmosphere. When one side believes time is on its side, pressure loses its edge. The zero tariff proposal remains on the table. Simple, direct. Remove all duties, Canada will match the move, and talks begin without threats hanging in the air. It is framed not as a plea, but as a reasonable reset. A door left open, not a concession begged for. Behind that posture sits an economy that adjusted faster than expected. Workarounds were found, new buyers stepped in, domestic investment filled some of the gaps, growth slowed, but stability held. And that stability matters more than any single trade figure when facing high-stakes negotiations. This is where the broader implications come into focus. What is being tested here is not just a trade agreement, it is the effectiveness of economic pressure in a world where information travels instantly and alternatives can be built faster than before. The assumption that size guarantees obedience no longer holds as firmly as it once did. For decades, the threat of market access was enough to force alignment, but when that threat becomes unpredictable, partners respond by reducing exposure. Once that process begins, it does not reverse easily. Relationships diversify, dependence shrinks, influence follows. Canada's experience may become a reference point for others watching closely. Mid-sized economies, trade-dependent nations, countries that once believed resistance was impossible. The lesson is not that pressure never works, it is that pressure has limits. And when those limits are crossed, the response can reshape the system itself. As for what happens next, no one can say with certainty. The 2026 review will be tense, concessions will be demanded, lines will be tested, but the dynamic entering that room will not resemble what many expected a year earlier. Canada will not arrive desperate, it will arrive prepared. And that is the real shift. Not a victory declared, not a deal signed, but a repositioning completed. Whether Washington adapts to that reality or doubles down on old assumptions will define the future of North American trade. One thing is already clear: this was never just about tariffs, it was about leverage, patience, and how power actually works when even smaller economies find ways to stand their ground. This is Dylan News, bringing you the full picture, not just the headlines.